Joining me to talk about this topic of research and evaluation in distance education is, first of all, on my right, Dr. Mustafa Bunza. Mustafa is the director of the National Teachers Institute in Nigeria. On his right is a colleague of mine at the Open Learning Agency, Dr. Tony Bates. Tony's role in the agency is that of Executive Director of Research and Strategic Planning. And on Tony's right is Dr. Naidu, who is an instructional designer in the Distance Education Center at the University of Southern Queensland. Gentlemen, let me begin by throwing out a general kind of observation which I'd like you to react to. It seems to me that on one hand we have distance education and open learning as the most rapidly expanding phenomenon in education in global terms that perhaps we've ever seen. And yet I would observe that by and large that development is occurring largely on the basis of shared experience that for the most part is not examined, at least not examined in a systematic, empirical sort of way. That, if you agree, it seems to me would issue something of a clarion call for something of a more systematic approach to identifying the questions that we think are relevant, to talking about the priorities of those questions, and of course to talking about strategies on an international basis through which we might pursue those important research questions more effectively. But first let me ask you to react to my general observation that by and large we're flying by the seat of our pants as opposed to systematically informed knowledge. Why don't
yeah, I think, Glen, I would have to agree with your assertion about the nature of distance education activity. And I think that it is true that much of distance education activity is based on experience. And I would have to agree that there is a need for a greater degree of research and evaluation activity, kind of activities, to enhance the processes of distance education that is going on globally. What makes distance education different from other forms of educational activity is the nature of the processes of learning and teaching that goes on. Therefore, in my mind, the heart of the matter in distance education is the processes of learning and teaching, and I think that needs to be systematically examined. There's an abundance of experience in the literature of research and evaluation for examining that kind of activity, and I would think that my bias would be to look at the processes of learning and teaching, or learning and instruction, if you like. I myself have engaged myself into examining, evaluating instructional strategies and learning strategies that form an integral component of distance education activity. And I think we can draw from prior experiences in other forms of educational activity, at least in terms of methodologies.
Yeah, well, you're suggesting some interesting questions, some which we'll come back to. But Mustafa, how do you react to the general observation that we could benefit more from perhaps more empiricism in our approaches in the way we approach this topic?
Well, in fact, Glen, this is the topic we are on, particularly in Africa. A lot of this area of distance education had been accepted, but then the cost effectiveness of the whole scheme has been examined by various governments so as to save quite a lot on the distribution of funds, in this governmental budgeting on distance education or conventional education. And we felt that there is a need to do more on the cost effectiveness on distance education to know exactly what we are in for, not just to accept the mode that it had been introduced, and a lot of collaborations are being made from one region or the other. But it is our view that we must have tentative research, and administratively we are doing something on our part on the research topic on distance education so that we can come up to a conclusive stand which will assist the government in financing the distance education.
Tony, I guess this question can be put another way, and it's sort of a quantitative versus qualitative dichotomy that I'm talking about. And my observation is that we've been fairly strong on the qualitative aspects of research, not so strong on the quantitative aspects. Why don't you come at it from that perspective?
Well, yeah, sure. What I'd like to do, though, is to go back to your first assumption and point out that I wouldn't like to see new developments in distance education held back because people want hard, systematic proof that it's valuable. I think there is a tendency to, in some jurisdictions, to sit back and say, well, until you come forward with hard and fast evidence that this is really important, then we're not going to put any money into it. I think there's enough experiential evidence now to suggest that open and distance learning is valuable in certain contexts. The second issue that concerns me is that with regard to qualitative and quantitative, I disagree. I think there's far too much quantitative research. There's lots of facts about numbers of students and amounts of money spent, but going back to Som's point, I think that there's not enough evaluation as to what kind of learning takes place in the distance education context and how that compares with the kind of learning that takes place in the campus-based context. Good.
Well, it seems to me that the reality is that we have, in world terms, an absolutely incredible amount of activity going on, and it's growing almost exponentially. As a result of that, we have, in fact, a multitude of venues in which to look and evaluate activities. And within that, of course, all kinds of particular questions that we might be interested in. Let's turn to that aspect in so far as the future that we see and the opportunities to investigate some of these questions or to look at our experience. In your earlier comments, Sam, you were talking about the teaching-learning process or the instructional process as being sort of one dimension of this where there are undoubtedly a number of particular questions that you think we should look at. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, part of it comes out of my own bias, and I think that as an instructional designer, my focus is on that. But let me say up front that I think the point that Mustafa has raised about costs of distance education activity is something that needs to be examined too. But I will address the issue of learning and instruction that goes on in distance education. As an instructional scientist, my focus, therefore, is on learning and teaching. And I think I'm not going to propose that distance education students are, very different. They are different, of course, from conventional students who take on conventional educational activity. But I think that's not the issue. We need to understand the learning and teaching processes on both fronts. And not from the point of view of them being different from one another, but what instructional strategies are most appropriate, what learning strategies can be induced or taught in the context of the use of self-instructional materials.
Sam, can I stop you on that point and interject with regard to the need to look at the efficacy of different instructional strategies?
Yeah.
Most of the research that I've looked at suggests that instructional strategy, instructional model, if one is dealing with motivated learners, doesn't matter, that learners will learn in spite of the teacher or the methodology. How does that fit with your point?
I will agree with you, but what percentage of the learners are we talking about who are very highly motivated to the extent that they don't need any assistance? We cannot, in my mind, work on the basis that if they are motivated learners, they will get through the system. That's like talking about doctoral students. If you want the PhD, come and get it. But I think here we are talking of people who are studying under very severe constraints, economic and otherwise, who need a great deal of help. We forget that in a conventional situation, we provide students with a lot of help, which are not structured. So why not provide the same kind of help in a distance education situation? And I think when we're developing instructional materials, we have to focus on what learning strategies learners use, how can they be intensified, how can they be induced, how can they be taught, and what instructional strategies should be used to present the content. We are talking about content analysis, we're talking about instructional analysis, we're talking about elaboration of content, we're talking about summarizing content, we're talking about analyzing, synthesizing, and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, I just want to stop you there because you've enunciated a number of particular research questions, any one of which could be pursued in the context of a study. Tony, how well are we at this point informed on those kinds of questions that Sam has just talked about? What's your view of sort of the adequacy of the literature as it stands now?
Well, I think some probably would answer that better than me, but it seems very fragmented at the moment. What we see is a lot of isolated individual studies, often done by people doing PhDs in a university context aimed at, I mean, we could say a lot about the appropriateness of the PhD format for doing useful research. I mean, I have some grave reservations about this. People are forced through a whole set of hoops to meet a university requirement. And what that leads to is a lot of uncoordinated, unfragmented research, which is very hard to piece together. What we don't have is any kind of systematic approach or team approach to research in these areas, or very few. And if there are ones, I'd like to hear about them.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I'd like to conclude on the point that Tony has just raised, because I think there are a lot of untapped opportunities. Mustafa, from the standpoint of someone who I think comes at these questions perhaps more than any of us from a sort of a national policy point of view, how do the kinds of research questions and data fit in policy formulation in relation to importance, as opposed to the cost effectiveness thing? Because it seems to me these things are always in tension.
Well, in fact, this as an administrator of distance learning, this is what we are battling with. We have got a lot of these researches into various aspects on distance learning, be it qualitative or quantitative, and the cost effectiveness. But what we want now, actually, and this is what we are on, is the research findings, so that we can get the practical aspect of the whole issue of research being conducted in various areas. As Tony has said, they are fragmented, and we have got a lot of them, either from the universities or from our own staff who are doing it. But what we want is to make the findings available, particularly for the policymakers, so that we know where to allocate our priorities.
Mm-hmm. Sam, you've talked about one cluster of questions relating to, I'll put it in my words, the characteristics of the learners, and knowing as much as we can about that. But there's another set of questions here that have to do with instructional methodology that it seems to me are becoming extremely important, not well explored because the technology is so new. We are awash in new technologies, interactive video teaching, multimedia, and so forth. Do you have some observations about that? And Tony, I'd like you to respond to this question as well.
Well, I'm tempted to cite this reference, although it may sound too pedantic. As early as 1983, Richard Clarke, from coming out of traditional conventional education, literature has stated and shown quite elaborately that research on, or comparative research on the questions of which media or medium is better than the other is the wrong question to address. And while the commercial sector is dumping technology onto distant education community faster than they're being developed, I think we have to be very careful of the costs and the logistics and other factors that go with it on the use of these technologies. This is why I like to hone in on the issue of the processes of learning and teaching that goes on in distance education activity, and not unless we're looking at the cost effectiveness of different technologies, not look at the questions of research on technologies themselves, but how technology can be used to enhance the processes of learning and teaching. I think that is the heart of the matter. That's where the research question should be focused on. However, I want to say it again, that I think we need to evaluate, not carry out research, but evaluate the cost effectiveness of computer conferencing, for example, the logistics of computer conferencing, or audiographic communication. These things are good for engineering teaching. These are good for teaching graphic arts, for example. But then economies of scale, user-friendliness, and costs of equipment are the things that we need to examine. And I have, for example, a couple of students with me who are examining the cost-effectiveness of audiographic communication in the use of in teaching graphic arts. Now, a lot of people will say you cannot teach graphic art or fine arts in the distance education mode. But there is a technology which can make it possible. But we need to find out how cost-effective these things are.
Okay, I want to just put the remainder of the discussion on this topic. I think it's extremely important. I think we're to the nub of what is important in the future. But I want to put it in the following framework. It seems to me that there are essentially three, let's call them dependent variables here, that one can look at in the context of evaluation and research. One is effectiveness. Does the particular strategy or set of strategies effectively assist the learner to master the skills and knowledge of whatever the experience may be about? Secondly, efficiency in terms of, I guess, dollar cost in achieving certain results. And the third is acceptability. Things may be effective, may be able to be done effective, and they may be able to do them efficient, but to the target group of learners that we're after, the methodology is unacceptable. Would it be useful to talk about research in terms of those three areas? You were on the effectiveness side of things, I think, Sam. Tony, do you want to sort of pursue that one a bit more?
Well, I'd have to think about that. I've not seen research in those terms. I guess the emphasis has been more on the efficiency than it has on the other two in the research that's been done. I think we haven't paid anywhere near enough attention to the acceptability side. I've always looked upon the acceptability side, I've used a different term, accessibility. If you can't get the technology, for instance, or if the teaching is delivered in a way that is inconvenient for you, then it's not going to work for distance educators. And I think we need to know a lot more about what students are prepared or not prepared to do in order to make distance education work. I think, too, that there's been such a vacuum for the kind of students that we're serving that in many countries the first 5 to 10 years have been easy. I mean, there's been so many students wanting this service that they've been quite willing to accept quite poor quality in terms or things that don't really meet their needs or don't meet them in the best possible way. And there's been enough demand to see people through. I think that there are lots of ways we can be improving distance education, and I think we ought to be focusing a lot more on student needs and how they want that education delivered than we have done in the past. I mean, we've been happy that in many instances the institutions have been turning away students rather than trying to fill places. And that makes you rather lazy in terms of analysing what students really need.
Mustafa, from the perspective of the developing world, I'd like to have you sort of respond to the questions that Tony and Sam were just talking about.
Well, I think the areas of interest in development world are all the topics that you have listed. The efficiency, the cost effectiveness, and then, of course, the efficiency. As of now, we have got a lot of students in the developing world going into various aspects, using technology in the developed countries. When they come back into the areas where they are to operate, they find a lot of difficulties. And as such, the adjustment into the areas in the developing countries seem to be very difficult. We have got the conceptual knowledge of what to do, but because of the limitations of the facilities available, you find that the research they have conducted overseas or in the other developed countries seem to be a little bit meaningless at the moment. Therefore, it is the view that in the developing world, we should have asked ourselves this question of efficiency in terms of the available resources. And this is what we are actually hammering on, rather than to just take the research into the topic discussed by Tony in, well, deep research is not really what I think will be more effective for us as of now, but rather to have the resources available within our area and to conduct ourselves within the facilities.
Okay, gentlemen, we've got Mustafa here saying, look, the critical kinds of information that he needs is in terms of the essentially the cost-benefit side of things, which is a little bit different than some of the perspective that you were coming from, which was more the sort of instructional effectiveness, never mind the cost sort of thing. I know you weren't saying that, but I'd like you and Tony to respond to what Mustafa's just said.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with Mustafa's comment there. I think having come out of the developing world myself, I'm well aware, and don't tell me that the developed world is not facing problems of costs and project management. I mean, the problems are as realistic there as well. It's just questions of scale and applicability that we're talking about. I think, as I said, I think one point that comes into mind when Mustafa is talking about project management or cost effectiveness, we are talking about two things here. We're talking about research and evaluation, and I think I should want to make a difference or try and tease out the differences between the two. A considerable amount of literature exists on systematic evaluation activity, and I think that that should be pursued. And when we're talking about effectiveness or cost effectiveness or project management, then that's the area of evaluation, to look at cost effectiveness of different kinds of media for the purposes of delivering different kinds of content to different kinds of learners. Now that's a whole area of activity that should be pursued, irrespective of where you are. It is more realistic in a developing kind of a context because money is tighter than in the developed context. Then there is the question of research, and I think there is a significant difference between the kind of research activity that I would like to be seen, carried out, and this is when an evaluation activity, and research should be concerned with the processes of learning and teaching, the issues of learning and instructional strategies. And evaluation should be confined to project management and cost effectiveness. I think then we are generating some knowledge for the purposes of enhancing delivery of distance education activity.
I'd like to put in a plug for a kind of research that isn't really very much done in distance education and which would address some of the issues that Mustafa is concerned with, and that's policy research, that's forward-looking research. Research that looks at the changing market for education, it looks at the changing technologies, what's coming through the pipeline in the next 2 to 3 years, so that you can organize and develop distance teaching programs that meet those changing needs. Very often we're just responding, or research is backward looking. It's saying, you know, we've got a project, did it work? Instead of saying, and when you find that out, you find the world has changed and you need another project, which is quite different. And the second thing I'd say about the research for developing countries is their need is for looking at some of the big issues, the macro issues. And a lot of the research looks at relatively, for obvious reasons, because it's done by PhD students, it looks at very tiny, small segments of the problem, and then hopefully you accumulate those things together. That's not very helpful for developing countries. They want some big research, rough and dirty research, I'd call it, but that tackles some of the problems that they're facing and provides them with a system that will work in their own context. One of the real reasons why research isn't done on a collaborative or cross-national basis is because the experience is that most successful distance education systems are unique to their own circumstances, and that makes generalization from one system to another rather difficult. So there are good reasons why research often isn't helpful from one country to another. Having said that, I think there are regional issues that are often common, and research done on a regional basis could be very useful.
This is a point. Tony's raising a point that I was pursuing, and I think there's still a little bit of cloud in what I'm trying to say, that there is a difference between hardcore research, if you like, and evaluation. In fact, in distance education, if I can say this, we need a greater amount of evaluation activity, both formative and summative evaluation activity, to find how different technologies are working, different methodologies are working, different processes are working, and surely enough in different areas. But that experience and that kind of work is necessary. I would not like to use the terminology research to categorize that kind of work. I'm not denigrating the value of evaluation. I think formative evaluation and summative evaluation, ongoing evaluation, if you like, applied evaluation, if you like, is very important. Perhaps more important than research into the learning and processes of teaching, if I may say so. Hardcore research, quantitative or qualitative, if you like, whatever, can go into the processes of learning and teaching. And I think in order to benefit the developing world in setting up effective, efficient, acceptable distance education systems, a lot of evaluative data is necessary.
Well, I think this is where I agree more with Tony. We have got a lot of this paperwork on this issue. It has been done quite a lot, but the applicability of the researches, that is the need of the developing world now. You find that when you are talking of the teleconferencing, if you go to Canada or in your own case in Australia, a lot of these are so easy, but in the developing world, you find that they have heard of it, they have read of it, but the application of this, so as to make it quite efficient to the regional system of where they belong, this is where the interest begins. So that if you take it for Africa, for example, we have not got such satellites which you can utilize this. Yeah. We have read it, what to do, and we know what to do. But we are inefficient in getting these type of materials. Therefore, what the developing world is saying, you have done these researches, you have got them, we have read them, but how do we apply them in the absence of the materials we are talking of? The technology in Africa, for example, is not at all near where you are thinking of in Canada or in Australia. Therefore, we should bring researchers, or our research funding should come down to the grassroots. The grassroots means the developing world also, so as to benefit.
Well, the
collaboration can come in later, I agree.
You were picking up, I must say, you were picking up on the point that I made initially, that the processes of learning and the processes of instruction are very important. Forget the teleconferencing, forget the video conferencing in the developing situation. How do we present the content? How do we enhance learning? What kind of strategies do we use? And we're talking about entirely print-based materials here in that kind of situation. And having had some experience from the developing world, we place very little emphasis on the presentation or putting together a book of readings, for example, or a study guide. We slap these things on, and these things are slapped on as a result of lack of resources and lack of skill in doing so. But if we can concentrate on that, if we can concentrate on learning strategies, if we can concentrate on instructional strategies, then we are a long way in helping a situation like the one that you're describing.
Can I pick up on that point, though? I mean, you said, well, we're therefore talking about print-based technologies, but actually, if you follow the logic of your argument through, you're not even doing that. For instance, you may want to use radio, where radio is more appropriate for oral societies, but the strategies are the same. You're looking at ways of developing interaction and design. But radio may be, and this is where I think we need more research, as to what kind of technologies are appropriate, not just in terms of access, but in terms of acceptability to the audience. And we know that there is some evidence coming out now that there are quite large differences between different cultures. For instance, in Canada, there seems to be evidence that native Indians much prefer audio-visual presentation to print presentation. And there are probably good cultural reasons for that. So therefore, I think it's very important in developing countries that there's some research done into the modalities of learning and then try to adapt the delivery to that rather than to just import strategies from overseas.
Exactly. I think this is the area actually we are talking about.
We have to agree with that. But in any educational, what I'm saying, in any instructional system, there's a triumvirate, if you like, of issues that are important, and research should be focused on them: the learner, the context, and the content.
Yes, that's agreed. But the application of it, this is what Tony has said. In the developing world, let us look at the radio networking, for example. it may be much better.
That's right. I'm not disagreeing with that. What I'm trying to say is how that might be approached. Yeah, if you're looking at the issues, if you're looking at content, what kind of content you're delivering, if you're looking at what context, that's right, what region you're talking about, if you're looking at what kind of learners, they're Inuits or they're Aboriginals or they're Caucasians living in New York City.
What I hear Mustafa saying, and you tell me if I'm not interpreting it accurately,
yes,
is that a lot of the research in this field is being led by people who are doing it from the perspective of the so-called developed world.
Exactly.
What I hear Mustafa saying is that we need researchers to undertake an examination of these variables that we're talking about, these questions, from the context of the realities of the developing world.
Exactly.
I think that as we look at the kind of development, the kind of financial crisis that both the developed world and the developing world is facing, is that we need to find models that go beyond what I call the institutional model. That has to do with collaboration. That means more in terms of looking at systems that include traditional universities and colleges as part of the system, as well as single-mode distance teaching institutions and so on. I don't think we, have had very much experience in developing those models, and I don't see much in the literature to help me as an administrator try and adapt my own organization to that new reality. And I think it's critical to getting to the collaboration that you've been implying is important in the area of research. Could we talk about that for a few minutes?
As my colleagues would agree, serious research or systematic research which looks at the core of the processes of learning and teaching is a very individualistic thing, and research that occurs in higher institutions of learning is very individualized. Professors engage in research largely in very narrow areas and largely for self-enhancement. And I think then but I'm not supporting that. I'm saying that that's the nature of research activity. I agree that this kind of skill, and there isn't enough of it in the developed world to be shared on a collaborative manner. And here we're talking about project management. We're talking about management of research and evaluation activity.
Well, I want to interject here. I think there's a really big gap in the kinds of research that are required for developing countries, which is not going to come through individualized research done by people in developed countries. I think the multilateral agencies have been negligent, is the only word I can use, in the way they've set up projects. They have set up projects very often, or funded projects, without having done the preliminary research that's required. I think there is a need for multidisciplinary teams drawn from different countries on a regional basis to do research into this field. Without that kind of nucleus of people working together, that will look at a wide range of issues, because setting up a new system is a complex matter and has to have a number of things looked at. Without that kind of support, you're going to get a lot of trial and error and a lot of wasted money. And everybody sees research as something you do at the end of a project. It shouldn't. Research should be done at the beginning of a project, and it should be continue through the project and end with evaluation at the end.
Can I push you gentlemen to be zero in a little more on this point that Tony's making? We're here at the conference of the International Council of Distance Education. At this conference, the Commonwealth of Learning is signing a joint agreement. I mean, here are two, in world terms, I guess the two most significant international organizations there are to try to foster this. What Tony has just said would seem to me to have fairly strong implications for perhaps the policies, the priorities, the directions that these two organizations separately or collaboratively might foster. What would you say about that? And let me turn to some.
Yep. Well, I will have to agree with Tony, and that's the point that I was making. That traditionally research has been focused in faculties and departments, and I think that And that's largely the objective of institutions such as the Commonwealth of Learning, such as the ICDE, or such as regional organizations like ASPISA or whatever that are affiliated to ICDE, that there are people who are qualified in the processes of doing research and evaluation, and there are people who need that kind of skill distributed, and people who need information that come out of those activities. These organizations can be very instrumental in identifying people who have the basic skills, the integral skills to carry out systematic research and evaluation, identify them, put them into teams, put them into groups, finance those, and expect research and evaluation to be carried out.
Okay, I'm going to put my friend Mustafa on the spot. In wearing another hat, Mustafa is also a member of the Board of Governors of the Commonwealth of Learning. Mustafa, what Tony has said, what Sam has said, and in terms of policy of an organization like the Commonwealth of Learning, as it relates to the topic we've been talking about, what do you take away from this conversation?
Well, I think from some of what we have dealt with, the collaboration is the only alternative that is open to the developing world in particular. And I feel that the Commonwealth of Learning, as of now, has already started on this. They have started on the regional level, and this has gone into the international level. And I believe this is the salvation that we have, so as not to waste much of our resources on the researches which have already been conducted in other areas. So this collaboration aspect, as has been put up by Commonwealth of Learning, has gone a long way to assist, particularly in Africa, I know of that, and in particular in Nigeria, we have got a lot of materials that have been researched on by other countries through the assistance of Commonwealth of Learning. We have been making adaptation to the need of our own country, and I believe this has happened to the regional system as well. So I believe this is where our salvation lies, the collaboration.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for this. They have, I think, done an excellent job in a very short period of time of pretty sharply defining some of the categories of research questions that are important. For example, some began by talking about the area of instructional design as it relates to teaching and learning and so forth. Tony Bates picked up on that and talked about the importance of knowing more about our learners, their characteristics, and what's acceptable to them. We talked about the whole area of policy as something that at the front end of development might benefit much more from an examination of research, including what's known and what can be generalized from elsewhere. We've also talked about the category of organizational models, because organizational models are changing within nation states as well as within institutions. And that, of course, led us to talk about the whole area of collaboration and the idea that we must move to enable international networks of individuals and institutions to pursue questions. And my friend Mustafa reminded us all of the the importance of the venue, the perspective from which the researcher comes in terms of the ultimate applicability or utilization of research findings. So I want to thank them all very sincerely for, I think, a very erudite analysis and a lively conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.